And I just want to welcome everyone to the Poets Corner. Whether you've been here before or this is your first time coming, it's great to see all of you. And we formed the Poets Corner in 2020, in June of 2020. My friend Catherine Seitz and I co-founded it. We were sheltered in, and we really wanted a community of writers. So we decided to establish this Poets Corner monthly Zoom readers with events to create a community among writers and readers of poetry and short prose. And one of our readers today was one of our first readers on the program, Laura Bonazzoli, in the summer of 2020. And our other reader today, Morgan Talty, is new for us. And we're so pleased to have them both here. Most of our readings have been poetry and intermixed occasionally with prose, fiction or nonfiction. And today's a special treat for us because these two authors have recently published fictional story collections, both in the form of a story cycle, and we're going to hear more about that later on. Morgan Talty will be reading from Night of the Living Res, and Laura Bonazzoli will be reading from Consecration Pond. And if you don't have either of those books, I know by the end of today, you will want to rush out and buy them. And we'll put something in the chat about where to buy them. So a few reminders of upcoming events on the Poets Corner. Oh, and I didn't say that I'm joined today by Audrey Lay, and Audrey is a member of the Poets Corner Advisory Board. She's a poet and also a novelist, with her first novel coming out in 2024 called Gray Ledges. So very pleased to have Audrey be a co-host of today's Poets Corner event. So some upcoming events. On April 2nd, Mark Burroughs will be back to read from his newly published translation of poems by Hilda Domin called The Wandering Radiance. Well known in Germany, but never before translated into English, I believe, Domin is a German Jewish poet who left Germany before World War II and then returned to her homeland after the war. Domin's life and her poetry explores themes that are very relevant to us today. What does it mean to live with hospitality towards others, to go back to a place where we've been betrayed and create beauty? What more daring thing could we do after facing horror and trauma than to make art? And how does our longing for homeland bring us hope, even in exile? So Mark will be joined by Chris Nelson and his publisher, Domin's friend and biographer, Marian Tauschwitz, and also I wrote down Hilary Domin, but it's Hilary Davis, who's a poet and literary critic. And in celebration of National Poetry Month, this program is being brought to you in collaboration with Mercy by the Sea. That is April 2nd. Then we're back on April 23rd, two events in the month of April, to celebrate Earth Day with John Paul Caponegro and a selection of eco-poems and eco-poetry. And you'll hear more about an open call for submission to read with John Paul during that event. Stay tuned for that. That'll be followed closely on the heels on May 7th with a reading by Megan Sterling, hosted by Megan Sterling, called Clock of Cream and Flame, Mothers on Motherhood, Megan will be joined by poets Sonia Greenfield, Abby Murray, and Catherine Hagopian Berry, whose poetry collection called Orbit was published in 2022 by Toad Hall Editions, who is also the publisher of Laura Bonazzoli's book, Consecration Pond. The phrase clock of cream and flame comes from a poem by Sharon Olds called My First Weeks. And its final stanza goes like this: glorious life, and it would always be there, behind those nights of tap water, the whole way back, that fortnight of unlimited ration, every 4 hours, clock of cream and flame, I have known heaven. So Morgan, who just had his firstborn child 2 weeks ago, is experiencing that every 4 hours or whatever, what it's like to be up all night with a newborn. And we're very lucky that he's able to join us today. And so appreciated that he will be here asleep or awake. Beginning in June, we're also launching the first of our Corner Craft Talks on the Poets Corner. And this first one will be about hybrid forms with Julie Marie Wade. And you'll hear more about that in the coming month. But first, I want to introduce Laura Bonazzoli.
Can you hear me?
Well, let me introduce you first with a little bit of an introduction. And I was just looking for that introduction because I wrote it out, but I did it from memory. So maybe I'll just do it from memory. I just want to say that I first met Laura in January of 2020. And I had just retired and I was invited to join a poetry group. And we met that first time in Laura's beautiful apartment in a renovated schoolhouse. And I learned then what a wonderful poet she is and what a generous teacher, appreciator of language. And in your response, Laura, to my poems and other people's poems was just so helpful and so beautiful and so generous. I can see why you're a teacher and an editor and all the other things you do besides write poetry. Your poems have been published in more than 30 different literary magazines, and your short stories have also been published in several journals before being collected into this edition called Consecration Pond by Toad Hall Editions. Mm-hmm. And it really shares that same lyricism that your poetry does. I mean, your poetry that you've read on the Poets Corner moved me to tears. And when I read Consecration Pond, it had that same lyrical beauty and love of language. Mm. And I'm not surprised that you have, I think, an MFA in theater, because I've heard you read and perform, and just the way you inhabit the voices in this book is speaks to me of theater and all the other wonderful things that you do that you bring to your work. And I would say your work is writing, but it's also so much more than writing. So it's such a pleasure to have you here today. And I hope that everyone will join me in a very warm welcome for Laura Bonazzoli.
Thank you so much, Meg, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you. It really touches my heart. Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be reading today, not only reading from Consecration Pond, but sharing with people a little bit about this genre of the short story cycle that I like so much. And so I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about what is a short story cycle and why do I like it? So that's where I'll begin. when we say or hear that a short story cycle is a group of linked short stories, you might ask yourself, well, how are they linked? So according to my sources, there are 3 common ways that the individual short stories within a cycle are linked. And first, they often have a shared setting and time period. Second, they often have recurring characters. Not always, but they often do. Third, they have recurring themes. And in my experience, this is always the case. Even when the setting and the time period and the characters may differ from one story to the next, one or more themes hold that cycle together as a collection. So it's important to understand when we say that they're linked, that each story in the cycle should be meaningful independently. Each story should be its own complete work of art. And in fact, some of the stories in Consecration Pond, and I know in Night of the Living Res, were published independently in literary magazines, and they worked that way. But an advantage of a short story cycle is that within the collection, the stories reflect back on one another to create for readers an experience of meaning that is broader and deeper than the meaning of any individual story. So the whole cycle becomes greater than the sum of its parts, the individual stories. So short story cycles also present certain challenges for readers. Jennifer Smith, the author of The American Short Story Cycle, points out that readers typically come to the genre with, quote, expectations of unity. But instead, what they get is a certain degree of fragmentation. Short story cycles have time gaps. They're not continuous, and variability in their characters and in their situations that make the reading experience comparable to, say, looking at a collection of old family videos, as opposed to sitting and watching an entire 2-hour film. So, as you can probably guess, this fragmentation means that short story cycles demand a little bit more from the reader. As you, the reader, assemble the fragments, the individual stories, in your own mind as you read, you, I would claim, co-create the full story as it's meaningful to you. And I find this particular aspect of short story cycles really cool. They have a spaciousness that reminds me of looking at a collage or reading a volume of contemporary poetry, and that invites the reader's interpretation, and even maybe one could say requires that reader's interpretation of the whole. So I hope you'll get at least a hint of this quality as I read some excerpts from Consecration Pond. So the book contains 11 stories that are linked in 4 ways. They all take place within a span of a few years on this fictional Consecration Pond in rural Maine. The characters are all members of the same community by the pond, and the characters recur. The narrator of one story may be a very important figure or a minor figure in another story or 2. The stories are also all narrated in first person, with the narrators speaking not to you, the reader, but to someone else within the same story, whether they're physically present or present only in the narrator's imagination. And we'll see this in the excerpts that I'll read. The stories are also linked by shared themes, and the 2 most important of these themes are interwoven. They are acquiescence to the events of the past, which we obviously cannot change, and consecration, by which I mean an act of dedication to the sacred, whatever the sacred might mean to any particular character. Some characters are able to engage in this 2-step process of acquiescence and consecration, and other characters and other stories are not. So now I'd like to share short excerpts from 3 of the stories. The first excerpt is from the opening story, Prayer of the Bell. It's narrated by a young woman named Lucy. It's the middle of the night. She's outdoors by the pond talking to her next door neighbor, Jenny. And Jenny is really there with her in the story, but we never hear Jenny answer because she lost her voice during a fire 3 years ago in which her husband died. Jenny is the narrator of the 4th story in the collection. And my 3rd excerpt today is from that story. So you'll hear a little bit from Jenny. You'll also hear in this excerpt the name Genko. Genko is Jenny's son, and he narrates the final story in the book. So here are the first few pages of Prayer of the Bell. I guess you probably want to know how I got to be in a mess like this. Maybe I should start out by saying I'm not smart. My dad is smart. He's a material scientist. And my sister, that's Sonia, she's a chemical engineer. And my brother Sam designs cars. I can't even drive a car because I can't pass my driving test, which is why I ride my bike everywhere, which is how I met Genko a couple of months ago when I moved here at the start of summer. He was getting your mail when I rode my bike past your driveway, and I stopped and said hello. He asked me if he could ride my bike sometimes if he stuck to the road around the pond. And I said, sure, if he'd promise he'd always bring it back when I needed it, because I have to ride my bike to work and stuff because I can't drive. And he said he would, and that's how Genko and me met. Anyway, if you want to know how this happened, and I feel better now, by the way, well, I guess like everything else in my life, I don't know. It's like it just did. If I was smart, I maybe could have stopped it from happening. But Dad says I take after my mom, and he married my mom for her looks, not her brains. And Sonia and Sam got mom's looks and his brains, but I got stuff the other way around. That's why I live in my dad's cottage in summer, because him and my stepmom get tired of me hanging around their house. And I embarrass them riding my bike around like a kid like Genko. And they throw these pool parties all summer long and don't want to have to be explaining me all the time. So that's why I'm here. And I don't mean to sound like I don't like it. I'm glad I'm here. I like to be alone and come out to the pond at night and listen to the loons and the frogs. I bring my quilt and lie down on our dock and look up at all the stars surrounding me like I'm in a cave of stars. You ever notice how you watch and all of a sudden it's like the roof of stars starts to come down toward you so you feel like you can almost touch them? You ever do that? Just come out at night and listen and look? I see you all the time in the daytime watering and weeding your vegetables and flowers, and at sunset when you come out and ring your bell, but not when it's really dark. If my dad would fix it so I could, I'd live here right through the winter like you and Genko, and on clear nights, I'd get my quilt and walk out to the pond all iced over and lie down at the end of the dock with the frogs all frozen asleep underneath me and watch the stars. I guess you're waiting for me to say, though, how I got to be messed up like this. It must be hard having to listen to people and not be able to tell them to hurry up. I just want to say, I really appreciate you coming over to help me tonight. And I'm really sorry about the fire and your husband dying and you're not being able to talk. Genko said you wouldn't mind him telling me, and I hope you don't. And I wouldn't tell anybody else. I guess it came out one day because I asked him, why do you always wear a scarf tied right up high around your neck, even when it's boiling hot out? And that's when he told me you got burned. But he said, you got a settlement, and that's how you could buy your cottage. And he said, you're okay now, and that you don't mind talking, and that you love Earth. That's the way he put it. He said, you love Earth. So like I said, I don't know why it happened, but I guess it must have started because I took the astronomy course at the junior college. Sonia said, don't bother, Lucy, you need to know math to do astronomy. But I said, it wasn't like I was saying I wanted to be an astronomer, though I'd love that, of course. just that I wanted to be able to name the stars and know why the moon gets bigger and smaller, that kind of stuff, that's all. So Sonia said she'd help me fill out the registration form, and I took the class, but Sonia was right, I flunked. Even though I studied most of the time in class, I thought I knew what the teacher was teaching. So that was a big disappointment. But the thing that came out of it was they were looking for volunteers to help out at their Friday night planetarium shows this summer. And I volunteered, and they took me as an usher. That's how I met Gregory. He was real nice to me, thanking me every night for volunteering. And that was pretty amazing because he's going for his PhD and knows everything there is to know about astronomy. Maybe you already know what I'm going to say happened, and you don't even need me to say it. But I swear I didn't mean it to happen, and I sure didn't know it was going to. So the next excerpt is from the second story in the collection. It's called Wild Geese. It's narrated by a high school senior named Gus, who appears in several stories. In Wild Geese, Gus is talking in his mind to a classmate named Wells, who OD'd the previous weekend and is hospitalized. The setting for the story is the ruins of an old house, a very important old house on the shores of Consecration Pond. For this excerpt, I'm jumping into the story several pages in, when Gus is talking about a fight that he and his friends had with Wells a few weeks before. You'll hear the name Nicolaitis, who's the high school principal, and Holloman, who's an English teacher. And incidentally, Holloman narrates the 9th story in the collection, in which Gus is a key character. So here we go. This is jumping into the middle here. A couple of pages of Wild Geese. Okay, it was a shitty thing to say, but you shouldn't have tried to hit him. He's like twice your size. And even if he wasn't, you're totally outnumbered, but you get all badass and try to hit him. What did you expect? Of course, Josh is going to grab you. So then Seifert goes and lands it right in your face. Then Mendez gets in on it. Then me. But I swear, it's not how you think. I didn't want to, Wells. I'm standing there and there's blood coming out of your nose and mouth and you fall right at me and you're making this choking sound. And I don't know, it was like I was tripping out because everything sort of broke apart, like in slow motion. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking about that poem Holloman made us read in freshman comp by the World War I guy about the gas attack. I don't know why. And it's way too loud and bright, like this crazy war movie. But I'm in the movie. And when you fall, I'm not thinking, what am I going to do? It's like I'm part of the movie and this is what I'm supposed to do. And so I just let go and kick. But Seifert's the one who kicked you in the balls and made you fold up on the ground like that. I swear, that wasn't me. After we walked away, it's like I crashed back out of it. Seifert and Josh and Mendez got in Seifert's car. He told me to get in too, but I said, no, I had my dad's car. I waited till they were gone, and then I walked back to where we'd left you. Honest to God, I thought you'd still be on the ground. But you were sitting on the bench, just sort of staring. For a second, now that I knew that you were okay, I thought maybe I should just walk away, that maybe you'd rather be alone. But then you looked straight at me. What the fuck was I supposed to say? So I picked up your cell phone and put it next to your backpack. And then I told you the honest to God truth, that I didn't know how it happened, and I was sorry. Totally lame, I know. Maybe that's why you just kept looking at me and finally told me to fuck off. And then today, they tell us you OD'd Saturday night, and now you're in Maine Med, and Nicolaitis calls everybody in for an interview. And at the end of my interview, I ask him if he thinks you're going to be okay, and he doesn't answer for a minute, and then he shakes his head and says, no, Gus, I don't think he is. I couldn't go home. You fucking yourself over like that, I just couldn't. So without even deciding to really, I came here to the ruins I guess I knew I would. You ever have the same dream over and over when you were a kid? I always dreamed I had this secret hiding place nobody else knew about. I'd go into the woods to this one tree with a burl I could open like it's a door, and inside was a button, and I'd press it, and the whole tree would split apart like a big gate, and I'd walk inside, and the sky is this dark, bright blue and covered with stars, but they're huge, and instead of white, they're pure gold, and all the trees and shit, everything's lit up with this gold light, and it's quiet, but I can hear crickets chirping. And every time I go there, I know it's my place, not like I'm a king or anything, but like it belongs to me. I stopped having that dream a long time ago, but that's kind of how I feel here. I wish now I'd shown it to you. A couple of weeks ago, I almost did, but I don't know why, something held me back. Mostly, I just like to keep it to myself, even though lots of other people know it's here. I'm not sure who it belongs to. The descendants of whoever inherited it from that Civil War guy who bought the land and named the pond. They're in California now, Holloman told me, and there's some fight about who owns what part of it, and nobody's got enough money to fix it or even tear it down. So nothing's happened for years and years, and now it's ruins. But I still feel like it belongs to me. Nobody, I don't think even Holloman, knows it like I do. So I'll show it to you, like it's mine. The fourth story in Consecration Pond is called Fish, Birds, Light, and it's narrated by Jenny, the neighbor in Prayer of the Bell. Remember that Jenny was injured in a fire that killed her husband, Ren, so she can't talk. But in this story, she's talking in her mind to Ren's ghost. I'll just read the first 2 pages. Fish, Birds, Light. Impermanence. It's what they tried to teach us at the monastery. Of course, it was the most important lesson. At the time, though, long before we met, I resisted. On my board, I painted fish, koi, orange and pink and turquoise and blue, with little hills of blue. Everyone said, "How beautiful, fish swimming in a pond of blue sand." The final morning, the monks made me sweep it into the stream. They wouldn't even let me take a picture. "Nothing," they said. "All gone," and smiled. And I let it go. I should have learned the lesson then, or practiced until I did. Instead of herbs, echinacea, yarrow, I should have planted daylilies. Instead of lamps, lit candles. Instead of love letters, written the word fugacious 10,000 times, then burned the paper. It might have helped. Yesterday, for instance, when I saw your parents' letter, your father's handwriting, and for one crazy second, thought it was from you. Or any day these last 3 years, pick one. Pick today, for instance. This morning, for instance, when I went down to the pond to fill my watering can and heard the little slapping sound and followed it just in time to see a silvery minnow flip-flopping its dance macabre, its scales sparkling with reflected light. I knelt, reached out my hands and scooped it up, wanting to give it back to the pond. But it was already limp, its eyes blank. How did it come to be there? Perhaps a gull had dropped it. Who knows why anybody, anything, comes to be anywhere? Frayed wire, for instance. Cellulose insulation, for instance. An argument, topic unrecalled. A young man, a father, knocked out on Ambien, alone in bed. A young woman, a mother, sleeping down the hall with her son. I tried to wake you, Wren. I swear I tried. I know. Let's not start that again. If we do, I might have to accuse you of sending that poor little fish just to make me watch it suffocate to death. Did you send it to me? Thank you.
Wow. Laura, that was amazing. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
And you bring these stories so to life with your reading. It's like watching play. I mean, you just perform and become that person. And we have a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to say that we'll save them for after, but I think I'll just ask you one of them now, and then we'll come back to others later on. So there was one that asked if you set out to write linked stories, and if so, did you begin with the first one, or where did you begin?
What a great question. So no, I wrote 3 of these stories as independent stories with no thought of a collection. And that is Prayer of the Bell, Frogs and Goddesses, which I actually wrote the first draft of 30 years ago. 30 years ago, that's the oldest. And Spring Ice. And Spring Ice and Prayer of the Bell were published in literary magazines. And one day, I just realized, oh, they both take place on a pond in Maine. And there's this name that we learn about in Spring Ice, Consecration Pond. And I thought, oh, that would be a beautiful name for a short story cycle. And then I realized, wait a minute, Frogs and Goddesses also takes place on a pond. So I had a third story. And the other way that it evolved as I began to think of the cycle is that as I thought about Lucy talking to her neighbor in Prayer of the Bell, I wanted to know more about the neighbor. Well, what did happen? And that led me to think, so her husband dies in a fire because he's knocked out on Ambien. And she rescues her son. So what impact would that have on her son? And so I really felt that I wanted to tell the son's story. The same thing happened with Spring Ice. Gus is very important in Spring Ice. I had to tell Gus's story, and I had to tell it early in the collection. Then I really wanted to tell Gus's mother's story. And so it built that way. And the final story that I wrote, and it's not the final story in the collection, but it's the last story I sat down and wrote, was the title story, Consecration Pond. And I knew for a long time I had to write a story that was narrated by the pond. It was the hardest story to write in many ways, but it was the story that I knew I had to have to link the collection together. So that's how it came to be. Yeah.
I am just awed at your imagination that you can write from all these so different characters, from this neurodiverse child to these young men, or high school age boys, to all of these characters, that you're able to bring them to life. It's incredible.
So voice is very important to me as a writer. Voice is, I always think to myself, I haven't gotten the voice yet. And I know if I don't have the voice yet, I don't have the story yet. So the voice is, my stories are voice driven. Even when I write in third person, which I also do, I can still hear the key character's voice. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Laura. And I know there are more questions and wonderful, wonderful comments to you. Bravo, applause, all of these, people love that you're reading. Thank you. But we're going to move on and we'll come back and we'll take the questions from the chat and maybe others after Morgan reads. So I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Audrey Lay, and ask her to introduce Morgan.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you. So Morgan Talty will be joining us today. I'm delighted that he's here. Morgan Talty is the author of Night of the Living Res. It's published by Tin House Books. It was published in 2022. And Night of the Living Res has received lots of critical acclaim and numerous awards, including a very recent one, which I hope Morgan will talk about. He is the winner of the 2023 PEN Award for debut short fiction. So congratulations, Morgan, on that and many other things. Morgan is the citizen of the Penobscot Nation, and he teaches at the University of Maine, as well as the American Indian Arts Institute in New Mexico. And his writing has appeared regularly in Narrative Magazine, and I hope he talks a little bit about that as the genesis of his Night of the Living Res short story collection. And he's also been published in Granta, the Georgia Review, Lit Hub, just to name a few. And so Morgan, welcome to the Poets Corner. And I can't see you. Where are you?
I'm here somewhere. I don't know if I talk.
I know. I'm hoping
Lucas will spotlight you.
There we
go.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you
Nice.
for that introduction, Audrey. And Laura, thank you so much for reading those lovely, lovely excerpts. I think Audrey had mentioned, I've lost all sense of like everything, but I just became a father a week ago. And so hearing that last bit that you read, Laura, I was like, I don't know if I'll be able to be on camera, but here I am. Yeah, I thought I'd read from Burn, and then me and Audrey would talk a little bit, or read from Night of the Living Res, the opening story, Burn, and then Audrey and I would talk for a little bit about the collection and short stories. And I think a lot of it will align really well with what Laura was talking about short story cycles and how they work, how they function, and why they're just underappreciated, I think, in the outside world. So this is Burn. This is the opening story of my collection, Night of the Living Res, which is a interconnected story collection that features the same character. We see him either as David or D, and the stories alternate. So we have D, who appears in Burn, and then we have David, who appears in the next story. And David's younger, D's older, and it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until we get to the end of the book, where there's kind of like, I suppose, a question that is answered, or maybe some questions. So yeah, this is the opening, and this is sort of what I think is like, really sort of sets the tone for the following 11 stories. Burn. Winter, and I walked the sidewalk at night along banks of hard snow. I'd come from Rab's apartment off the reservation. Rab, this white guy with a wide mouth and eyes that closed up when he laughed, sold pot. He was all no bullshit too. I had asked for a gram, and after he weighed it and put it in a plastic baggie and held it out to me, I reached into my pants and jacket pockets looking for the cash among the cigarette wrappers and pocket knife. And he didn't believe me as I acted the part and kept saying, shit, it must have fell out on the walk over here. He shook his head, took the weed out of the baggie and put it back into his mason jar. I ain't smoking you up, he said. And so then I said, fuck you, Rab, I really did lose the money. You'll see. Watch when I come back here in 30 minutes with the money I dropped. You'll feel stupid then. He shrugged a sorry man, and I slammed his door shut as I left. At the bridge to the reservation, the river was still frozen, ice shining white-blue under a full moon. The sidewalk on the bridge hadn't been shoveled since the last nor'easter crapped snow in November, and I walked in the boot prints everyone made who walked the walk to Overtown to get pot or catch the bus to wherever it was us Ephesians had to go, which wasn't anywhere because everything we needed, except pot, was on the res. Well, except Best Buy or Bed Bath & Beyond, but those natives who bought 4K Ultra DVDs or fresh white doilies had cars, wouldn't be taking the bus like me or Fellis did each day to the methadone clinic. That was another thing the res didn't have, the methadone clinic. We had sacred grounds where sweats and peyote ceremonies happened once a month. Except, I was ineligible to participate in a spiritual practice, according to the doc on the res. Natives damning natives. The roads on the res were quiet, trees bending under the weight of snow. When I passed the frozen swamp, a voice moaned out. I stopped walking. Nothing. So I kept on going on the sparkling road until I heard it again. Who's that? I yelled. The moan came again. It was a man, somewhere in the swamp. I got closer, listening. There it was, a low and breathy noise, and with my cold ear, I followed it. The swamp was frozen solid, the snow blown in piles, and so I slid over the ice, looking for the source of the noise. Moonlight through bare tree limbs lit the swamp, and caught among the tree stumps and solid snow was a person sprawled out on the ground. He was trying to sit up, but kept falling back, like he'd just done 1,000 crunches and was too sore to do just one more. It was Fellis. Fellis, I said, standing over him. He tried to sit up, but something pulled him back down. Fuck you, Fellis said, help me. He groaned, shivered. He didn't say how to help him, so I had to squat down to get a better look. I flicked my lighter and his purple lip quivered. Hurry, he said. Fellis, I said, I can't help you if I don't know what's the matter with you. My hair, he said. I looked at it with the lighter's flame. Holy, I said, and I laughed. Instead of the tight braid that shined, Fellis's hair had come undone, and it was frozen into the snow. Get me out, D, he said. D, get me out. At first, I tried to pull the hair out from the snow, tried to chip the snow away, but his hair wouldn't come loose, so I yanked, and Fellis screamed. Lift your head up, I said. I opened my pocket knife, and at the click of the blade, Fellis spoke. Wait, he said. Don't cut it. What do you want me to do? I said. Tell the ice to let go? Fellis spit. Go to my house and get boiling water. I closed the pocket knife. Fellis, I said, by the time I got back here, the water would be chilled. He was quiet, as if something walked around or among us. The ice cracked and echoed somewhere in the swamp. The moon shone bright, and I looked. There was nobody but us. I have to cut it, I said. You ain't getting out if I don't. Fellis asked if I had a cigarette. When I told him no, he cursed. Fucking bullshit, fucking goddamn winter, what the fuck? I laughed. It ain't funny, dude. Look, I said. You want me to cut my braid too? Fellis took a deep breath and he coughed and he gagged. No, he said, just cut it. I gotta get home. I'm sick. I opened the pocket knife again, grabbed his hair in a fistful and cut. When I got to the last bit of hair, Fellis rolled over and away from where he'd been stuck. He rubbed his head and he just woke up. I helped him stand. We slipped all over the ice on our way out of the swamp. Through dry heaves, Fellis said he missed the bus this morning for the methadone clinic. No shit, I said, because I didn't see him on the bus or at the clinic. And he thought some booze would be good before he got sick from not having any methadone. He'd had a bit of booze left that afternoon, but he decided to go see Rab to get some pot. And on the way, he'd stopped off in the swamp to feel the quiet that came with too much drinking. When he plopped down in the snow, he dozed right off. When he woke up, his hair was frozen in the snow. I got into his mom's, Beth's, where he still lived. He walked fine by himself to the door, but I walked with him up the steps. I never thought I'd scalp a fellow tribal member, I said. Fuck off, Fellis said. He fumbled in his pocket for his house key. You want to smoke, I asked? Didn't you listen? He said. I didn't make it to Rab's. He unlocked the door. I'll go for you, I said. Give me the cash. Fellis looked at me. 20 minutes, I said. I'll run there and back while you warm up your pretty bald head. He gave me $30, and I didn't ask where he got it from. Empty chips. Down Fellis's driveway, I imagined the look on Rab's face when I gave him the money. What'd I tell you? How about that grand? D, Fellis yelled. One more thing. Bring me my hair so we can burn it. Don't want spirits after us. We're damned anyway, I said, but I guess I'll get your hair. I kept going, wondering. Hair or pot first? Pot made the most sense. It would look strange having to set the hair and ice down like a soaked mop on the counter at Jim's while I reached in my pocket for Fellis's money. Jim, that old wood bugger, would say, we don't take those anymore. I'd look him square in his sagging face and say, I'm not trading no hair, you old fucker. And I'd smack down on the counter a $10 bill for the tall boys and chips. With the change jingling in my pocket, I'd walk to Rab's and he'd say, get that hair out of here, it's dripping on my floor. And I'd have to plop the hair on the muddy white floor in the hallway while Rab re-weighed the same nugs he'd weighed earlier for me. No. I'd grab Fellis's hair from the swamp on my way home. With Fellis on his unmade bed, me on a torn beanbag in the corner, each of us with a tall boy in the pot smoke hazing gray of the room, we'd keep poking and squeezing the hair, waiting for it to dry, waiting to burn it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Morgan.
Can I just ask a question in here? It's somebody's comment that sometimes the sound is muffled and sometimes it's freezing, and I don't know if Luca has a solution for that, or if you do, Morgan.
I think that's probably an individual.
I don't, because
unfortunately.
I've
Yeah,
had it
I'm in the
too.
middle of nowhere, so my internet is really bad.
Okay, so it's nothing we can do about it. Okay.
Your internet is great, Morgan. You're here with us. We're delighted that we're here. This is why we started the Poets Corner, because connected though disconnected we are here. Hey, what an unbelievably provocative story. You and I have talked about this before, using the word scalp. The ideas that are put forward here, that I want to talk about drugs a little bit too, because that imagery comes back again and again in your book. But can you talk a little bit about how you got to this story, how you know, the inspiration for it, and maybe for that friend Fellis, who also recurs throughout the book?
Yeah, so I had written, so this is a story I'd actually heard from a friend who heard it from somebody else. It was about this, he heard a story about a native guy who this white guy had found and passed, like, when I say recently, I mean within like the past like 10 years, found him on the other side of a bridge, and he had fallen asleep in a snowbank, and he had his hair frozen in the snow. And this non-native guy had to cut this native dude's hair off. And I heard that story, and I was just cracking up. I was like, it was the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But you know, I kept thinking about it, and I was like, God, there's so much like to say about that. Like, there's so much social commentary. And I tried to write like an essay about it, but like I couldn't, because like I'd heard the story like 2 people removed. You know, like I didn't really know. Like all I knew were those details, and so. Right. I was like, well, apparently it's not going to work as nonfiction. And so before that, I'd known this story. I was working on my book, Night of the Living Res, and I had written the first draft of it, and it just didn't work. It was just not a good, not a good book. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll go do something else. And so I put the book aside and went and wrote. I was like, I'll write Burn. You know, I'd been hearing this name Fellis in my head. I have no idea where it came from. And so I wrote Burn, not intending it for it to be connected in any way whatsoever to Night of the Living Res, except, you know, perhaps by, I didn't mean for it to be related at all to the characters in Night of the Living Res, like David. But I had written from David's point of view for so long that I got to the line where Fellis says, "Get me out, D." Fellis said, "D, get me out." For rhythm purposes, and like just for, you know, giving a name, you know, I was like, I have to say David here. Like, this is like, I almost said David, and I was like, no, this isn't David. This is somebody else. This is a completely different story. So I resisted it, and I, you know, just went on and I finished the story. And then finally, somebody's flying by in a snowmobile, sorry. Finally, I stopped resisting, and I was like, well, wait, what if this is David? Like, what if this is David all grown up? And it brought, you know, the 10 stories I'd already had that were all about David, you know, I saw them in a different way. And so Burn became this turning point in me writing the book. And so I was like, all right, well, let me figure out who D and Fellis are and what's going on. And it was just like, if I hadn't written that story, I don't know if Night of the Living Res would have existed. Like, I don't think it would have. Like, that was the key to getting me to where I needed to be.
And you had already written, you said 10 other stories. You already had Night of the Living Res. And
yeah, I'd written
Smokes Last and all of those.
Yeah, I had Night of the Living Res. I had Smokes Last, and I had a couple other stories that didn't make it in there, but I had different renditions ultimately that appeared in the collection. And yeah, Night of the Living Res was the very first story I ever wrote for this book. Not intending it for it to be a book, just intending for it to be a story. And now I think in the book it's the second to last story. Right. But yeah, I'd already had some written, but then I wrote, I don't know, between 14, 15 or 16 stories told from David's point of view, chose 10 of the best and read it. And I was like, God, this is bad. And then did everything I just said I did, went and wrote Burn.
Right. And to put it first in the story too sets a tone of so many things. I mean, when I first read it, I actually heard you read it before the book was out. And just the idea, residential schools cutting hair, was that was just such a part of Native life. And to have that identity stolen. And this story is, it's humorous, but it's really provocative, and it's tough. So it's, I don't know, but people seem to be able to relate in some way. I don't know. We'll talk a little more about that. I want to wait for that. I want to talk about friendship. I want to talk about Fellis. Characters do come to us in these interesting ways. And you've talked about Fellis, you don't know where his name came from, but there is clearly this deep friendship that comes, between him and is it Tyson? What's the other friend's name?
So there's David, and then there's Tyson and JP in those younger stories.
Tyson and JP, right.
Yeah.
So, would you talk a little bit about friendship between these boys and their growing up on the res?
Yeah, friendship is or relationships in general are such an integral part to storytelling, because it's, you can't, I always tell writers, I'm like, please don't write a story with just one character. You need have two people in there, have two people doing something. And this kind of goes with what Ellen Goldsmith posed a question in the chat about, one interesting thing to me in Burn is Dee's offer to cut off his own hair. I see it as connecting and compassion in a cold place in life. Is it intended that way? So for me, I don't know if it's intended that way specifically, but I'm always deeply interested in the ways that we as people can help other people, and sort of thinking about the ways we kind of overlook the way we treat people. There's all these subtle moments in Burn and elsewhere that I tried to nurture when writing. One example is when Dee offers to cut his own hair. He's kind of like, well, would it make you feel better if I cut my braid hair, my braid? And we just kind of moved on. And he was like, no. And then we see at the end of that story, he's like, Fellis seemed to walk fine by himself, but I still walked with him up the steps. And so he kind of he's still helping him. And there's just these moments, these gestures where people are there for one another. And it's you need that. You need that in a healthy lifestyle, and you need that especially in a lifestyle where there is a lot of trauma and struggle. I think it's become very customary for people to toss away difficult people in their lives because of their difficultness. And so for me, it's just a deep and very important aspect of my own fiction.
That's an interesting thing, talking about tossing people away when there's trauma. I have heard that before, and in some cultures, many cultures, people will take in and sort of breathe in the person who is going through the trauma. Whereas in America right now, it's sort of this tough love idea. It's very interesting, but that's there's much to go into with that. But I want to ask you about so many things. There are many questions on the chat popping up, but this month or last month marked 2 years since you lost your mom, and I'm so sorry. And yet it's also the same month that you are now a new dad, and congratulations on your little boy, and to your wife, Jordan. She is amazing. Both of you have had this incredible year, 2 years. So well done. And you're here and unslept, but just doing great. But talking about family and, and the mother figure, and you've got, one of my favorite stories of yours is The Gambler. And you said that's coming out in a new book, also by Tin House next year, 2024. And what is the title of that next book? If you don't
Fire Exit.
Okay, Fire Exit. So great. And you're going to include that story, The Gambler, which is about your dad. You want to talk a little bit about, I don't know, this interpretation of fatherhood all of a sudden, and having been a writer, and also, I don't want to mix up too many questions, but also where are you as a writer? Is there any time for you? I mean, I know he's only a couple of weeks old, so But you've got to, you've got some changes going on in your life, and looking back and looking forward. If you want to talk a little bit about that in whatever comes up for you.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly will tell you I have not written a single thing since he's been born, besides emails and text messages. I have said no to a lot of things recently, which has been nice. But no, I mean, I am, he was born, tomorrow will mark a week, so it's still like,
oh my God.
Yeah, it's only been a week. So it's like, it's so fresh and it's so new. And it's like, it's fascinating. It's like, I was sitting, I think we were in the hospital still. And I remembered I was like, how do I say this? It was like the moment you feel like, or like, this is how I learned about art. It was like the moment you feel like you've got it figured out, you're going to like ruin it. And so I remember sitting in the hospital and like we were all content with how things were going. And then they started going sideways. And, just having him, the routine gets messed up and stuff. And so I was like, it's the same with life. It's like, if you feel like you're too settled, you might be missing something, or something along those ways, or in those words. But it's been a blessing, and I'm like just waiting for the day where I can get a full night's sleep.
And that exhaustion, there's something to be said. Some of the mystics and seers of old loved to have sleep deprivation as one of their best inspirations for writing. So, Hildegard von Bingen and Julian of Norwich, they were just, that they were really inspired by not sleeping. So just go for it, Morgan. You're amazing. So you can, maybe the non-sleep will be just fine. I want to ask you also about the role of women and the mother figure and the sister, and in Night of the Living Res, that short story in particular. If you want to give a little bit of background for folks, and speaking of trauma, some of the trauma that goes on there, is that what I don't want to ask what inspired it, but this is a work of fiction. I don't know. Talk a little bit about that story in particular, the titular story.
Burn, you mean?
No, of Night of the Living Res. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the book has moments of, autobiographical elements to it. I feel like I started out as a nonfiction writer when I first started writing, when I was, 13 years ago, when I was like 18, 19. I came to writing as a nonfiction writer, and I wrote mostly memoir, like family slice of life stuff. And I started to find myself in places where I'm like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? Or wouldn't it be cool if the story had actually occurred in this way? And so I started to move into fiction. And so that was how I got into fiction. And so I always, like, if there's a line between, the real and the make-believe, I almost always have at least like a fingernail in like the real life, and I always give this example. Earth Speak, the story Earth Speak, where Dee and Phyllis cook up this plan to rob the tribal museum of the root clubs, because they saw on Antiques Roadshow how much they sold for. Nothing in that is autobiographical at all, except for the opening image of the clouds. The clouds hovered above the pines, like the webs of fall webworms and the crooks of brown branches, or something like that. I was driving one day when I saw that image, and I was like, oh, I gotta write that down. It looked very cool. It's like that's the only element in that story that's real, that like had come from my experience. And everything else is sort of secondary, the methadone stuff, all of those things. And then there's Safe Harbor, which Dee is visiting his mom in a crisis stabilization unit. And my mom suffered from severe depression and anxiety and alcoholism. And it's a place that she often went to, regroup. And I was there one day, and I saw her have a seizure, and it was one of the most frightening things I'd ever seen. And so that story, I got home and I wrote that story. I wrote everything that had happened that day out. So like you read that story, there was an exterminator there that day. There was a woman who wanted my mother to bring her cigarettes. Wanted me to bring her cigarettes. There's all these things that like very like nonfiction, conversations, nonfiction. There's a quote, there's an image of, in the narrative, Dee says something like, on a whiteboard in blue marker, quote is written, "A ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for." So like that was, taken from, I took all of that stuff and I wrote this piece and I was like, well, I don't know what to do with it. And then eventually I went back to it and I found myself being like, oh, okay, well, what if I made this happen? And that's sort of turned it into autofiction, fiction that's really grounded in, the real life, but then extends out into that fictional world. So that's a lot like how I tend to write, is like sometimes I draw entirely on, experience, and we'll have like 30% made up, or it'll be like 1% made up, or 1% real life, and then 99% real. So, but I might be escaping your question a little bit because my brain is
that's
kind of
fine.
tired.
It's all great. It's all great. So one of the folks here asked if you did grow up on the reservation, and I do believe you did grow up on Indian Island, correct?
I did. Yep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I guess one of my questions is, what, do you feel like your son might be missing something that you got as a kid? That community. There are many good things. There are many difficult things. Certainly the many of the things that you work with, I will leave it for folks to purchase the book and my deeply annotated text here, but it's such a sense of community, that close-knit, where you come from. There are issues of race, yes, there are issues of class, yes, but it is its own community. And do you have that in Levant? This is where you live. I don't know. You want to talk about growing up on the res a little bit for folks, and what
Yeah, growing up on the reservation, or Indian Island's unique in that it's an actual island, right? Yep. And that it's like 3 by 2 miles. It's not very big, and it's like everybody knows everybody's business, and everything's there. There's Indian Health Services, there's the school, there's tribal facilities, all of this stuff, and there's just stuff that's always happening. There's stuff that's always going on, and so obviously, I don't, growing up there, I loved that. I loved being able to go down to, there'd be a potluck or something on a Saturday, and you'd be able to just go and get food and like eat, and I don't know, start playing basketball when you're not supposed to and get yelled at and then thrown out of the community building, and come back the next time. So like there's always a lot of fun and running around in the woods. But it's like, I don't equate growing up on a reservation with being Indigenous at all. And so, for Charlie, I think, it's funny, I was filling out forms like, what is his race or ethnicity and stuff. And it was fun to click American Indian, just because, we're still here and stuff. But like with him, he's 6 days old. I speak to him in what limited Penobscot I have. When he grows up, he's going to know that this land was our people's land. He's going to know these things, and I'm going to bring him to the island. I'm going to bring him to community days, to all of those things. So while we're far away, while we're disconnected, we're still very much connected, I think.
Great, wonderful. Well, create your own community too, for sure. Have your own potlucks, get the kids over in all neighborhoods. Okay, well, we'll bring it back to the group here and connect the stories and talk about narrative in general, and these super compelling stories and their very raw and visceral, provocative ways of writing. And you've got very different voices, but let's just hear back from maybe Meg, if you wanted to add a question here.
Sure. Yeah. I just want to say thank you, Morgan, for reading, and thank you, Audrey, for the comments and questions with that. It is a fabulous book, and it's gritty and it's tough. And I got to say, I have favorites in both books, and this is a time that we'll come back to some of the questions in the chat, as well as some new ones that people might want to put in the chat. But I just want to say that my favorite in Night of the Living Rez was Blessing Tobacco. That story, and the grandmother in the story, and the empathy for, and I think you touched on this, for characters, and Laura touches on this in her stories too, characters that are, I want to say, flawed. They're people that have been traumatized, or are, that first character that Laura read that says, I'm not very smart. And the grandmother here that's clearly has some form of dementia and going on here. And, just getting, I'm just amazed that you can get inside the minds of these characters and bring them to life. And so I guess my question is, how do you do that? And, with such empathy also, these aren't flat characters whatsoever. Are they, do you draw on people? Do you know? Are you keen observers? And so I'll ask you first, Morgan, and then maybe Laura, you would comment on the same thing about your characters.
Yeah, I tend to, I never really draw from a particular person in real life. I tend to find that, in fiction, action equals character. So it's like thinking about what the people do, what these characters do, ultimately defines them. And so like, I'll go to the page with a general sense of maybe some attitudes that a character might have. I might be pulling from, an amalgamation of several different people I know or think I know, and I put them on the page. And so, I'm really, I focus on the craft of it a lot. I'm like, if character equals action, then I have to think about what these characters are doing, and I have to think about why they're doing it. And so I have to ultimately then think about their wants. What is it they want? What is it they're going to do to get it? Will they get it or will they not get it? And, those things, for me, when I put those in the forefront, they sort of guide me. They're like my flashlight. They sort of extend out as far as I can see, and I keep going. But that's my approach to inhabiting character, and paying really close attention though to that character through revision, not just drafting, but through revision, like thinking about like, okay, what is this character, would this character actually say this? Would this character actually do this? Really tightening them up so they're not so that they're neat and perfect, but that they're imperfectly perfect, is the thing that you really want to aim for.
Mm-hmm. Laura, if you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, a lot of what Morgan just said really resonates, especially that idea of revising and listening. Mm-hmm. Listening, would the character really say it that way? But I guess for me, what happens for me is that I tend to hear a voice. Somebody will start talking to me, and I don't really know where that voice comes from. And I'm like, well, what have you got to say? And sometimes I'll have an idea for a story, like Spring Ice is a good example, but I can't hear the voice. And I have to go to a quiet place and just trust that it may take 3 goes. It may take longer, but that voice finally will come to me. And with Holloman, the narrator of Spring Ice, all of a sudden I heard the voice of an English teacher I had met, not somebody who taught me English, but a different English teacher. And once I had that voice, we were all set to go, because that quality of that voice told me this is a man who reads Thoreau. This is a man who has these kinds of hands. This is a man who drinks in this way, and this is what he drinks. It all came through that voice. And I'll say, I mentioned earlier that the title story, Consecration Pond, was the most difficult story for me to write. I knew what I wanted it to say, but I just had no idea of how to get there. And I tried and I tried and I tried and nothing worked. And then one day I was just really sitting quietly and I heard the voice of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is the author of Braiding Sweetgrass. And I had loved that book. And I had listened to some videos of her, and I just loved listening to her, taking you through the woods and telling you about the moss and the different mushrooms and all of that. And suddenly I knew that that was the voice of the pond, that it was her voice. And once I had that voice, then the story came.
And so
I'm sorry.
No,
I
was
just want to make a comment on that because I think it's so interesting that you brought up that book, which I think is beautiful and also romanticizes, in a sense, this whole idea of the Native experience and what we know of it and appreciation for it. Whereas your book, Morgan, is in many ways the opposite. It shows us the grittiness of life, the addiction, the methadone clinics, the poverty and all of that, and doesn't seem to romanticize it at all. And not that one is better than the other, but I was wondering if you might comment on that, Morgan. Was that sort of an intention of yours?
Yeah, I think, I obviously was like, I'm not going to, for me, I don't like to sensationalize or, create I don't want to, I live on the road I live on, there's my in-laws, and then there's where we live, and then my brother and sister-in-law, and they just went by with their kid on the sled. I just had to say that, but so no, my little community. So I don't like to toy with people's perceptions about what they think they know about a particular group of people. Sherman Alexie was infamous for doing that when he was publishing before he disappeared during the Me Too movement. And I think, so I always wanted to avoid that. I always wanted to try to avoid it because I just didn't think it was an effective way to tell a story. Like, I think emotion, we shouldn't be moved by a specific act. We should be moved by other elements. And so that's not to say fiction that's written unlike mine, that's Native oriented, isn't bad Native fiction. I just think we need to write these different forms of Native fiction to get a broader perspective of that sort of centralized idea, which we'll never actually be able to ever define about like what is indigeneity, in a large scale. But the more Indigenous voices we have out there with the various different approaches, the closer we get to having, for readers, a general, introduction, not to a single Indian country, but the whole breadth of it, right?
I'm thinking.
I think you both do. I'm sorry, Audrey. I keep
no, that's okay. No,
breaking in, but I think you both do in different ways. And it's what I was saying about these characters, that you bring us these different ways of being in the world, whether it's being, Native or Indigenous origin, or whether it's being, this neurodiverse young woman or a young man who's, dealing with homosexuality and all of those things, that there are so many ways that we have of being in the world. And one of the things that I think fiction does for us so beautifully is it teaches us empathy in a way. It teaches us like what it's like to be in another body, if you will. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to comment on that, and thank you for your comments. Audrey, I was going to come back to you.
We were talking about Native voices. I think Morgan is mentioning that, and this the more voices you get. I have another question about the wants and wanting intensely, but I was going to ask about Tommy Orange's work. did you must have known that work when you were writing your work. Did you have, I mean, you've spoken with him, and he has provided some testimonials for your work. Do you have any connection with him now, or is there, I mean, speaking of numerous voices, and I mean, that's the West Coast and Native American culture in Oakland, California, and here you are in Maine. So, but that prevails.
I mean, we've never really talked at length. I know he read my book and Blurb did, and he was, when his book came out, he became super famous. I mean, and he's very, very busy. And
hello.
Yeah.
As did you.
And so I haven't met him in person, nor have we talked at length, but he's a great guy. But I think both of our fictions are, his book came out when my book was already done, and I was trying to find a home for it. And so it was fascinating to see it come out and to see it doing the things I was hoping my book would do. And at first I was like, damn it, this writer just came out and did what I wanted to do. But then I realized, I was like, well, wait, no, I was like, he kind of just paved the way. And like, that's what I think about like his book is like, I think he upended people's expectations about what Native literature is, so that, there's all these Native, I mean, you look at the Penn Awards that were just out, and there were like 4 books by Native writers in there, if not more, either winners or finalists or, long lists. And so his book really made it, I think, really gave space for these disparate Indigenous voices to be heard and to be understood in the context of their own histories and their own environments, as opposed to what a reader might bring to the story that they think they know is Indigenous.
Right. And I think you both Tommy Orange's book, There, and your Night of the Living Res has so much to say about belonging and what is tribal and what it means to be a tribe, despite differences. Certainly many of the folks in his book, anyway, I read them almost within, I don't know, just a few months of each other, not by a plan, just by accident. So and both just are, they I think it's just an interesting, they sort of are texts that they speak to one another in many ways, not meaning to, perhaps. I want to talk about—
Audrey, can I just interrupt again? Because I know we only have about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we get to a couple of questions that have come up in the chat, because we said that we would. And I want to go back to, I think Ellen Goldsmith asked a question about titles and the short story cycle. And wondering how the form impacts the choice of titles and does choosing, and what's that process of choosing titles? Is it similar to choosing titles in a collection of poetry? I think that's more to Laura, who's also a poet, but I think you could both speak to the question of titles. Do you want to start, Laura?
Sure. I think I said a moment ago that the title of my collection, Consecration Pond, comes from the fact that one of the first stories I wrote for the collection, Spring Ice, talks about why the pond is named that way and what's the, what the reference is and so on. And once I had that title, it drove so much because it gave me my theme of consecration. And it's something that I had been thinking about quite a bit, because I lost 3 of my siblings to cancer at relatively young ages. And it was always a process, and I wrote about this in quite a few poems, a process of acquiescence to that loss, and a feeling that, and I would not have used the word at the time, but a feeling that I had a choice of letting these things break me, really, or finding a way to consecrate the life and to move on. And a poem that was extremely important to me when I was first building Consecration Pond is called The Pond by Howard Nemerov. And he uses the word consecration in the poem. And he also uses the word acquiescence in the poem. And he talks about a child who drowns in a pond. And it's a brilliant poem, a masterpiece of a poem, The Pond by Howard Nemerov. Essentially, it was that idea of consecration that led me to work through all of the stories, even Frogs and Goddesses, which, as I say, was a first draft 30 years ago when none of these thoughts were in my mind. But to rewrite, to revise, and to have that experience of bringing in those themes. So that's how it worked for me.
Well, I am so sorry for those losses in your life. And this book, is haunted by loss and beautifully so. And I can see how even writing this book is an act of consecration. And Frogs and Goddesses, if I didn't already say it, is just my favorite story in this book. So, Morgan, did you want to comment on titles?
They are hard. They're very hard. I don't know, I tend to default to two. Sometimes I'm like, I'll find a particular line in a story that I wrote that I feel like will work well as the title of the piece. Like Burn, for example, like it ends with, waiting to burn it. And so we start with burn and we end with the word burn in a way, or one word off. But then other times it's kind of like, I try to find the most concrete, specific stuff. There's something about it that I think lends the story some power and potency. The Blessing Tobacco, for example, is like a really specific title. The Blessing Tobacco, a first draft title of that was actually Juncture, right? And like, that's a title that is like, it makes you think, right? But it's not like, it makes you think in a way that gets away, at least for me, gets away from theme and story and character. And the Blessing Tobacco, it kind of like gives you a little taste of what you're going to get, not thematically, but literally. And so like for me, I've always thought to keep titles practical. And I read submissions for the Massachusetts Review. I'm an editor there. And I see this a lot in submissions of nonfiction and fiction, where the titles are just very abstract, and it's like they don't quite grab you, and you want them to grab you. You want them to have some purpose beyond the need to have one there, so to speak.
And did you choose them specifically for the titles to relate to each other because once it became the book, or not? They just were individual?
They were just individual. I didn't think about Laura had talked about this early on, about how an interconnected story collection or story cycle is like each piece will stand alone. And so like I didn't care if something was titled one thing and another thing was titled another. I didn't try to find, because too many connections, to make too many connections or to make too much of a fuss about the interconnectedness of a story collection gets the reader thinking about, well, why isn't this a novel? So it's like this fine, like tightrope balance where you're like, okay, I can't implicate these stories in a larger narrative arc, but I have to suggest them in one. I have to suggest them in a very subtle way. And so I always tried to avoid any connecting moments, but it gets hard. Sometimes stuff crosses over, sometimes characters cross paths, right? Like it has to happen. But there are ways to do it where it's not distracting the reader away from the fact that this is a fragmented book. This is a book that has been, this is a portraiture that has had some lines and portions of it erased, but you can still see what the image was.
Yeah, I love this form. I'm not a huge reader of short stories, and yet these books both just really grabbed me. And I think there is something about the commonality of place and the repetition of characters that keeps you engaged, but also makes you work as a reader.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I think that was all the questions from the chat. And if you had one that I didn't answer, I apologize. But I just want to close with a huge thank you to Morgan and Laura for reading with us today. I feel like we could have gone on for hours, and I know that we can't. But there's so much to talk about and so much to gain from these two beautiful books. And thank you, Audrey, for co-hosting this event with me. It's just been a fabulous event. And I hope that our listeners will come back on April 2nd for the Wandering Radiance. But thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
You so much. Thank you both. Okay, take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Be well.